Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's the CD guy, Johnny Z here. Thanks so much for tuning back into the channel. Some real sad news today for Iron Maiden fans. Former Maiden vocalist Paul DiAnno has passed away. So today, going to take a look back at his legacy in and outside of Iron Maiden and the impact that he had on the new wave of British heavy metal. Conquest Music has confirmed the passing of Paul DiAnno, who passed away today at his home at Salisbury at the age of 66 years old. Born in East London on May 17, 1958, DiAnno first came into prominence as the lead singer of Iron Maiden on lead vocals for their first two studio albums, those of course being Iron Maiden self-titled and Killers. Two classic records here, and I want to say I think the DiAnno era of Iron Maiden is very underrated, of course, because it gets eclipsed by all the great albums that Maiden put out with Bruce in the 80s as the years to come. But Paul DiAnno walked, so Bruce Dickinson and that era of Maiden could run. These two records really did provide the groundwork for the Maiden catalog, and they're really unique. They still stand out to this day. I think they've aged really well. Of course, you have that progressive influence there, that UFO influence from Steve Harris. But Paul DiAnno, during his tenure in the band, really brought more of a punk influence to the Iron Maiden sound that we have not heard since Killers. And so it's really interesting listening to those two records, how Paul DiAnno's influences and Steve Harris's influences kind of came together there. And so in that way, Paul DiAnno left an indelible mark in the Maiden catalog. And we haven't had a statement from the band yet, from Iron Maiden, but I'd imagine that their next 50th anniversary tour is going to be dedicated to him in some way, shape, or form. They will be performing a lot of songs live from these two records, right? They're teasing a lot of that early stuff. So, what's important to keep in mind is that, outside of Iron Maiden, Paul DiAnno has been touring for years up until his passing and have been doing a lot of material from these records, And there's some extremely strong stuff on there, some absolute classics, some all-time, classic Maiden songs there. And Paul DiAnno has kind of been keeping that material alive while Maiden was doing, other stuff. And so, during his tenure in the band, he definitely was the right frontman for Iron Maiden at that point. The band needed that sort of, rock frontman with, a raspy voice who had, that kind of rock star look to him. And that helped to put Maiden on the map. And, in a lot of other respects, put the new wave of British heavy metal on the map as well. Maiden were crucial in the rise of the new wave of British heavy metal in North America. And these two records were a big part of that. Before Number of the Beast, before Power Slave, before, Peace of Mind, Iron Maiden were, a great mix of prog and punk on those two records, and a lot of that has to do with Paul DiAnno, really infusing his influences onto the band. DiAnno would not always be on good terms with Iron Maiden. He had a falling out with them after they removed him from the band, replacing him with Bruce Dickinson instead for Number of the Beast, and he talks a lot about it in his tell-all book, The Beast. Really interesting, read. It's a really interesting, look into the mind of DiAnno. My copy is also signed by Paul DiAnno himself, which is kind of cool. But, he did some really solid work outside of Iron Maiden as well with Paul DiAnno's Killers. Made a really great album in the 90s with Paul DiAnno's Battlezone called Feel My Pain. And this is just a record that, it's very underrated, definitely flew under the radar. By the mid-90s, Paul DiAnno was not somebody that was being talked about frequently in metal forums, or definitely not in the mainstream. But this is a great heavy record, and DiAnno's vocals on here are really strong. The lyrics are super angry and poignant, and so he did some really great work outside of the band, even as recently as this year in 2024. Releasing an album with Paul DiAnno's Warhorse that, was pretty underrated. Not a lot of people are talking about it this year, but it did seem like he had, mended fences with the band a little bit. There was a picture of him and Steve Harris backstage at a Maiden show a few years ago, and then he met up with Bruce Dickinson earlier this year. There's a photo going around on the internet of him and Bruce holding up the others' respective albums, their respective new solo records, and so it's good that at least towards the end of his life, it seems like he was able to patch things up with Iron Maiden, but his legacy definitely does go beyond what he did in Maiden, although it's lesser talked about. Some really interesting albums in his catalog outside of Maiden that, again, really helped to personify that new wave of British heavy metal sound, even if it was more from an underrated, low-key perspective. He was definitely an unsung hero in the new wave of British heavy metal, and just in metal in general. Although time was not very kind to him, I think his legacy of those records still ages pretty well. And when it comes down to it, like I said, Iron Maiden would not be where they are today if they didn't have their beginnings starting out with those two great albums with DiAnno on lead vocals. So that wraps up this brief tribute here to Paul DiAnno, a new wave of British heavy metal legend and one of the most important figures in Iron Maiden history who passed away today at the age of 66. Definitely somebody who is underrated, lesser talked about, but an unsung hero in heavy metal history, and so I thought it was important to pay tribute to DiAnno here today. Definitely go ahead and give these two albums a listen on the day of his passing to pay tribute to Paul DiAnno. They're great records, great albums in the Maiden catalog, and give a listen to this album here if you're able to find it on YouTube or if you own it. Paul DiAnno's Battlezone, Feel My Pain, great underrated record, one of his all-time best as far as I'm concerned, so yeah, Paul DiAnno passed away today at the age of 66. Rest in peace. One of the all-time best and most important figures in metal history.